Let me start by welcoming you to this webinar where I will give a sample lecture from the module that I teach, that's Religion, Violence, and Conflict Transformation. My name is Joram Tarusarira, and I'm the coordinator of the master program, the track Religion, Conflict, and Globalization. So by way of process, I will give some input, and you're free to interact with me during the process. But however, I'm also pleased that at the end of my input, there will be an opportunity to engage with your questions. And I'm pleased to say assisting me here is Astrid Stoker, whom you will also meet shortly after. You can't see her at this point in time, but you will see her. And also there will be Kes van den Ente, who is the student advisor in the faculty, who will also take some of your questions. Now, having said these preliminaries, let's get to the matter at hand today. I'm trying to go to the next, to my slide there, which is not coming up. But I would like us to look at the objectives of this sample lecture. So the title is Religion, Peace and Conflict, and the idea is for us to have an understanding or an appreciation of the role of religion in conflict and conflict transformation. So by the end of this sample lecture, I hope you will be able to explain the role of religion in conflict, violence, and conflict transformation. And you'll also be able to articulate the origin and the growth of religious peace building in relation to secularism, because our current world today is dominated by secularist thinking. But I'll say something about that later. Now, when we are talking about conflict and violence, I think there are certain basics that we need to understand. And more importantly, is what violence is, what is conflict, and what is violence. And I would like to share with you what I refer to as the models of conflict and violence. So this is basically an understanding of how we understand conflict and how we understand violence. For the most part, people tend to understand violence in terms of that which they can see, so which is visible, that which you can see with the visible eye or with the naked eye, so to speak. So you see people being attacked, bombs exploding, people losing limb, and a lot of direct happening. So there's an object in sight, and there is something taking place against that object. That's when we talk about visible. It is visible because we can see it. It is direct. But underlying visible violence or direct violence is invisible violence. And there are different types of invisible violences, so to speak. We can talk about cultural violence. We can also talk about what is called structural violence. And this is a model that we derive from the work of a leading scholar called Johan Galtung, who is also referred to as the father of peace-building studies, or the founder or the founding father of peace-building studies. What do we mean by cultural violence? I think is important. According to Galtung, cultural violence refers to those aspects of culture that are used to justify or to legitimate direct violence. And we normally find cultural violence in forms of religious beliefs or religious identities, or in form of ideologies. We can raise many examples here. You know, we have certain cultures that have a particular understanding towards, let's say, twins. You know, in some cultures, twins would be killed because they'll be perceived as bringing bad omen onto the community. We also have other communities that have an issue with, let's say, albinism in the case of some contexts in Africa. So people with albinism are violently treated because they are perceived to be bringing bad omen into the community. And we can have many more other examples we can talk about. So that would be cultural violence. So it's important for you to also think about your own context and try to look around yourself and see whether you can identify what you might refer to as cultural violence. Here I'm being general because the term culture itself is contested, and Those are some of the elements we'll dig into in the course. Well, what do we mean then by structural violence? According to Galtung, so structural violence refers to a form of violence where social structures and social institutions may harm people by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. So we have systems and structures that are limiting, that do not allow people to realize their potentials. In certain institutions, you might have what we might refer to as adultism, you know, a certain understanding or perception of people's ages. Because you're of this age, you can't do this or that. We can talk about class. We can talk about elitism. We can talk about ethnocentrism, nationalism, racism, phobias, sexism. Those will be forms of structural violence. So what is important is to understand that when we are looking at a violent situation, a conflict situation, there are always or often two sides to it, the visible side as well as the invisible side. And these sides tend to reinforce each other. This is why I'm very glad at this point to share with you this definition of violence from Joram Tarusarira. So he says, violence is present when human beings are being influenced so that their actual somatic and mental realizations are below their potential realization. So what you see here, especially when we look at somatic, you know, it refers to the body. When we look at the mental, it refers to our minds, our psyche. So when what you can do with your body is limited, so well, you have lost an arm, you have lost a leg. So your somatic actualization is limited. But you can also be complete, so to speak, with all your hands, all your body and everything. But when your mental capacities are prevented from realizing your potential, that's also violence. It is also important to understand that while Joram Galtung is cultural and structural violence, a leading French sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu, probably some of you might have encountered his works, he talks about symbolic violence, and which he defines as following. He says, when a holder of a symbolic capital, so when you talk about symbolic capital, we're talking about when you have honor, you have prestige, you have all the attention, and you use that prestige and honor to impress your power upon others such that they do not realize their potential. So it could be abuse of attention, abuse of honor, abuse of prestige. So cultural, structural, and symbolic violence are very important elements we need to understand at the very beginning of dealing with religion and as it is related to violence and conflict. Having said that, we are here interested in the relationship between religion, conflict, and violence. So let us try to look at some of the schools of thought that have been there in trying to understand this, to explain the relationship between religion and violence. So the first school of thought is one that condemns religion. So it says that religion is not innocent. And in so doing, what it is saying is, when we see violence in relation to religion, violence is inherently embedded in religious traditions. It is in there. So if we read the works of Mark Jugenschmeyer, who wrote this famous book, Terror in the Mind of God, he kind of presents this perspective where religion is seen as inherently violent. And he develops concepts which we will go in detail with, such as satanization. So he says religious people satanize everything, and they develop what he calls a cosmic war. So when the war becomes cosmic and there's an element of Satan, there's an element of the devil. So you create an enemy image in your mind of Satan, of the devil. The only option there is to eliminate, it is to kill. So religion is not innocent. This is one school of thought. The second school of thought says, well, religion is not inherently bad, or it's not inherently evil. It is actually instrumentalized. People do use religion for their own specific ends. But in itself, religion simply is. And for those who have philosophical sensibilities, you would know that every being is good in itself. So religion simply is. So that means it is only instrumentalized. The third school of thought says, well, forget about saying religion is innocent or is not innocent or is innocent or is instrumentalized. Religious people are pathological. So we have moved from the religious tradition, now we go to people. So religious people are seen as pathological. And we find this kind of thinking in books like this one, The Fundamentalist Mindset, where religious people are seen as having something that is wrong in their minds. They have a problem. They have a mental problem that they have to deal with. So it is a problem. It's kind of a sickness. There's something wrong with their psyche. So these are kind of three schools of thought that I would like to briefly introduce to you. And like I said, we would read text from this kind of books, and we will go in detail to try to unpack and read more into this kind of thinking. Now, I've explained the models of violence and conflict. I've explained the attempts to explain the relationship between religion and violence. Now, we are more interested in peace building, conflict transformation. Okay, there is violence, there is religion, but we are more interested in how do we realize a successful or a sustainable society where there is peace, where we handle conflicts in a way that is transformed. And at this point, I would like to bring you back to the models that I shared with you previously. And this is the model from Johan Galtung. And this is about visible violence and invisible violence. Again, in relation to direct physical violence, as well as invisible violence, specifically cultural violence and structural violence. So what I would like to point out here is that visible violence and invisible violence, they have a relationship with the type of conflict transformation process we take or the outcome of it. And when it comes to visible violence or direct or physical violence, I want to point out that often people tend to think that if we do not have visible violence, or if we do not have direct physical violence, then everything is okay. In the works of Galtung, that would actually mean achieving what we call negative peace. So we don't see people losing limb, we don't see people jumping at each other, we don't see bombs exploding. Everything looks normal. Or maybe there have been some intervention from maybe some actors or what have you. And then there is peace. There is no direct physical violence taking place. We refer to that as negative peace. And often negative peace is related to conflict resolution. For a long time, there has been a lot of interest in conflict resolution as a strategy. But of late, we have realized that conflict resolution has got limitations. And the limitations of conflict resolution is that it perceives or looks at conflict resolution perceives or looks at conflicts as puzzles or as mathematical problems that require a formula. So you come with a particular formula and you place it within a particular conflict situation, and then you resolve it quickly. So it's more like a solution-oriented process. That's conflict resolution. But we have realized that conflicts are not like that. They are complicated. There is more that is underneath. And only stopping direct violence is not good enough. So we have to go beyond negative peace. We have to go beyond conflict resolution towards positive peace. So when we're talking about positive peace, we're talking about a situation where we have addressed visible violence, that's direct and physical, but we have also addressed cultural violence. We have also addressed structural violence. So what you have there is addressing social injustices. So peace that lacks social justice is negative peace. And this takes me to a very important concept of just peace. So this is peace that embodies justice. So if peace does not embody justice, then it is not helpful at all. It is, well, people call it negative peace, actually I would say fake peace. You know, we are talking about fake news these days. So in this case, I'll say that it is fake peace. So, but the process that we tend to see being more useful in attending to conflict situations is conflict transformation. So this is where you dig deep to the invisible causes or influences of direct and visible violence. So remember I pointed out earlier that cultural violence and structural violence tend to legitimize direct violence. So visible, invisible violence, they are not necessarily disconnected. There is a connection because they tend to influence each other. So this is very important for us to have this understanding. Here you can tend to see this model from what might be referred to as an iceberg principle. You know, often you see a tip of an iceberg, but beneath it is a huge mountain that gives strength to what you see. So in conflict, you tend to see manifestations, but below the manifestations will be also many other things. Now, coming back to the relationship between religion and conflict transformation. Most of the processes of trying to intervene in conflict processes where religion is implicated have tended to be dominated by what I refer to as the secularist framework. I might want to point out here that since the Enlightenment period, you might know that religion and politics were separated because religion was seen to be absolutist, violent, divisive. So, and the secular framework was seen as neutral. So since then, the secularist framework has dominated the discourse and the reading of religion, politics, conflict, and violence. But there is a limitation to it. Then this limitation is that the secularist framework we have tends to overlook historical context. It tends to bring the state at the center of conflict transformation. And it ignores the role of faith, the role of spirituality in conflict and peace. And this limitation, amongst many other limitations we will talk about during the course, is it prompted scholars to start to think differently about the role of religion in conflict. A leading thesis we might want to work with is what is known as the ambivalence of the sacred thesis, which was developed by Scott Appleby, who argued that religion has the capacity to provoke violent as well as non-violent militancy. So it is two sides, so it is double-sided. That's the ambivalence. And Scott is a historian of religion, influenced by the German philosopher and theologian Rudolf Otto, who in his famous work, The Idea of the Holy, pointed out that the sacred projects a numinous quality. So in the sacred is embedded the quality of attraction as well as the quality of fear or dread. So it attracts in the same way as it also distracts. And this represents religion. It has these two sides. This line of thinking is also carried forward in the works of René Girard in his book, Violence and the Sacred, where he says, religion authorizes as well as contains violence. It can authorize it, but it can also contain it. Desmond Tutu said, well, religion is like fire. It is like a knife. It is just there, yeah? But you can use fire for good. You can also use it for the bad. In the same way, you can use a knife for the good as well as for the bad. Again, this depicts the ambivalence of the sacred. And the British sociologist James Beckford said, well, religion is a free-floating phenomenon. It is something that is out there, and everybody is free to reach out for it, grab it, and make use of it in any way that he or she wants. But the point that I'm putting across is that the limitation of the secularist framework prompted scholars to also look for something more than just the violent dynamic that was associated with religion. And this is where we are now, where we begin to see the other side, so to speak, of religion. But what's the interest? What prompts people to want to look into religion? I have a few sharings here. Religion tends to be associated with empathy. So it tends to be associated with nonviolence and pacifism, with sanctity of life, respect of life. It tends to be associated with interiority, elements like prayer, meditation, love, repentance, compassion, the discipline of the body, prophetic and moral imagination, apology, forgiveness, restorative justice as opposed to retributive justice. So these are some of the elements, again, we will dig deep into during in the module, trying to understand, okay, what is forgiveness? should somebody be forced to forgive, or what does it mean? What about an apology? We will look into the implications of these elements. But generally speaking, across religious traditions, we tend to find these elements. Now, so what I seem to have done until now is to have moved from the perspective of seeing religion as violent, which we, I talked about, to another side where we see religion as good. So it's moving from one end of the spectrum to the other. But as I come to the end of this short discussion, I don't want us to leave or close this with a wrong notion that we just move from this end to the other end. We won't have done anything. So religious peace building, I want you to understand, is that it is not a simple search for authentic interpretation of religion. Because if we begin to talk about authentic religion as well as interpretation, we already are in problems there. How can you talk about interpretation and then authenticity? So interpretation suggests multifacetedness in terms of understanding. So it's difficult to say this is authentic and this is not authentic. So I tend to say authentic interpretation in my view, but we can discuss this. And when you are here or here today, or when you come here to join us, I see authentic interpretation of religion as a contradiction in terms. So what you would say in Latin, contradictio in terminis. It's a wood and iron. You can't have interpretation and then talk about authenticity, but we can engage into this. Religious peace building is again not just simply talking about a religious peace builder versus a religious terrorist. It's not just two ends of the extreme. There is more in between. And it is also not a simplistic application of the ambivalence of the sacred thesis. Because what many people who have a sympathy with religion tend to do is to argue that, within religious tradition, we have so much rich, resources that can be used to intervene in peace, in violent contexts. You can, if you argue that way, the person who also says that religion is violent can also do the same. So we won't have done much. So instead of the simplistic application, we need to historicize and contextualize religious knowledge and practice. Let's put everything in context. Let's put everything in a historical trajectory. What has happened? Why is it happening? Who is involved and why? Let's be critical in our approaches. And that means we need to revise the secularist and modernist ontologies and epistemologies, which I pointed out earlier on that they've influenced how religion, conflict, politics, and peace have been read for the most part. We need to revisit this kind of approach. What is said to be and how we get to know about that which we say it is. So this is the realm of ontology as well as the realm of epistemology. But we will get more into these issues. So my concluding statement or point of reference is just peace, because just peace takes into consideration visible violence, invisible violence. When we look at religiously articulated violence and conflict, we should be able to say, okay, is this an element of visible violence? Is this an element of invisible violence? And where do we see visible and invisible violence? And we also probably in one way or the other, religion might also be implicated either invisible or invisible. But these are things we have to unpack. So I hope I have given you a kind of a general overview of the link between religion, conflict, and violence.